In the early months of 49 BC, a Roman general and statesman named Gaius Julius Caesar made a decision that would change the course of history. With his army at his back, Caesar marched southward through Italy. Soon he reached the banks of a modest river, the Rubicon. On the surface, the Rubicon was nothing special, shallow, and unremarkable. But by Roman law, it marked a hard boundary. No general was allowed to bring an army across it toward the city of Rome. To do so was considered an act of war against the Republic itself. Caesar knew this, and yet he crossed anyway. This single act, crossing the Rubicon, ignited civil war that would ultimately destroy the Roman Republic and lay the foundations for the Roman Empire. It's one of those rare moments in history when everything pivots. When a line is crossed and nothing can ever go back to the way it was. What makes this more remarkable is that just a few centuries earlier, Rome had been barely more than a dusty provincial town. In fact, around 390 BC, the city was sacked by invading Celtic tribes. At that point, Rome wasn't a dominant force. It was vulnerable, unknown to much of the world. But between that humiliation and Caesar's bold defiance, Rome had transformed into a rising superpower. This is the story of that transformation, the rise and eventual fall of the Roman Republic. There are two main stories about how Rome began. One is a myth, but a powerful one. According to legend, the city was founded in 753 BC by twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, who were said to be sons of the war god Mars, and a Vestal virgin named Rhea Silvia, abandoned as infants and left to die. The twins were famously rescued and suckled by a she-wolf near the banks of the river Tiber. As they grew, they attracted a band of followers and decided to build a city. But a dispute over which hill to build it on led Romulus to kill Remus. Romulus then named the new city after himself, Rome. Later Roman poets, especially Virgil in his epic The Aeneid, expanded on this origin. They connected Rome not just to mythology, but to the Trojan War, claiming that a Trojan prince named Aeneas had escaped the fall of Troy and founded a line that would lead to Romulus and Remus. In this way, the Romans linked their roots to the ancient and heroic city of Troy. But as fascinating as this myth is, it's not really how Rome came to be. Archaeological evidence paints a more grounded picture. Long before Romulus and Remus, there were people living in the area. By 1000 BC, small villages dotted the 7 hills that would eventually form the heart of Rome. Over time, these villages slowly merged into a larger settlement. The transformation from scattered tribes into a unified city probably happened gradually during the early Iron Age. There may have been a leader named Romulus, or someone like him who helped unify the region. But there's little hard evidence to support the myth in full. Still, the Romans believed it deeply. And they believed, too, that their early city was ruled by kings. They recorded the names of 7 of them. The first, of course, was Romulus. He supposedly ruled until 716 BC. After him came Numa Pompilius, who was credited with establishing Rome's early religious traditions and instituting a calendar. He was followed by Tullus Hostilius, then Ancus Marcius, Lucius Tarquinius, Priscus, Sarvius Tullius, and finally, Lucius Tarquinius, Superbus. This monarchy, according to tradition, wasn't strictly hereditary. Instead, kings after Romulus were chosen by a council of elders known as the Curiate Assembly. Whether that's true is uncertain. Many details of this era are clouded in legend. And early Roman historians were writing centuries later, relying heavily on oral tradition and political myth. Regardless, the kings were said to have ruled for over 2 centuries until the last one. Lucius Tarquinius Superbus Tarquinius the Proud pushed things too far. Tarquinius came to power in 534 BC through violence and intrigue. He ruled as a tyrant, ignored religious rites, disrespected the Senate, and waged wars to expand his influence. He also undertook massive construction projects, including temples and public buildings. But it was a personal scandal that finally triggered his downfall. His son assaulted a noblewoman named Lucretia, a horrific act that shocked the city. Tarquinius tried to cover it up, and the resulting outrage sparked a revolution. The people of Rome rose up. Tarquinius was overthrown and exiled. Dying far from the city he once ruled, With the monarchy gone, the Romans chose a new path. In 509 BC, right around the same time that monarchies across the Greek world were also being replaced, the Romans founded a republic. This was a system based not on kingship, but on shared governance. Power was spread across institutions and individuals. The Senate, composed of members of Rome's noble families, acted as the main deliberative body. The republic was also led by two consuls elected annually, who commanded the army and oversaw the state. There were checks and balances. No one man could hold too much power, at least. That was the idea, to represent the common people. Or plebeians, the Romans created the office of tribune. These officials were elected by the plebs and had the power to block legislation or decisions they believed were unjust. Over time, the tribunes would become a powerful force in Roman politics, offering a populist counterweight to the aristocratic Senate. By the 5th century BC, as the Republic solidified, we begin to have more concrete historical sources. His work, Urbu Condita, is a monumental account of Rome's history. But even Livy relied on legend and oral traditions when it came to the city's early years. Still, as the Republic matured, Rome began recording its own story more rigorously. In 449 BC, Rome codified its laws for the first time in what became known as the 12 Tables. These laws, inscribed on bronze tablets and displayed in the Forum, were foundational. They covered everything from property disputes to family law, even rules about what to do if your neighbor's tree falls on your land. The 12 Tables were the start of Rome's obsession with law, structure, and order, and they became the backbone of Roman civil society for centuries. Even today, much of modern Western legal thinking owes a debt to Rome's legal legacy. Yet despite this growing structure, Rome was not yet a superpower, far from it. At this stage, Rome was still a small city-state, controlling just the surrounding countryside and the lower stretches of the Tiber River down to the port of Ostia. The Etruscans to the north and the Greek colonies in the south were far more developed and wealthier. In fact, in 390 BC, Rome suffered a devastating blow. When Celtic tribes invaded again and sacked the city, it was a humiliating moment, but perhaps also a wake-up call. In the aftermath, Rome began to build itself up with new determination. It adopted a more militaristic stance and launched a series of wars against its neighbors. And slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. As the 3rd century BC rolled in, Rome was firmly established as the dominant power in central Italy. But dominance at home didn't mean peace. In fact, it signaled the beginning of a new chapter, one of endless warfare, expansion, and growing political strain. One of the first major conflicts that pushed Rome beyond Italy was with a formidable rival across the sea, Carthage. The Punic Wars were a series of brutal and world-defining battles between Rome and Carthage, a powerful city-state in North Africa. Carthage was a maritime powerhouse with colonies spread across the western Mediterranean. The First Punic War was largely naval and took place around Sicily. It ended with a Roman victory, but only barely. Rome had to build a fleet almost from scratch and suffered catastrophic losses, but they learned, adapted, and persisted. That was something of a Roman specialty. The Second Punic War, though, is the one that left a mark on history books everywhere. It's the war where Hanniblius, the guy who marched elephants over the Alps, nearly brought Rome to its knees. He invaded Italy from the north and won a series of devastating battles, including the infamous slaughter at Cannae. But even after all that, Rome held out. They refused to surrender, even as Hannibal roamed their countryside. Eventually, a Roman general named Scipio took the fight to Carthage itself, forcing Hannibal to return home. The war ended with Carthage defeated and humiliated. The Third Punic War was less dramatic but more tragic. Carthage was no longer a real threat. But the Romans, paranoid and unforgiving, destroyed the city anyway. In 146 BC, the survivors were sold into slavery. The land was supposedly salted, though that part might be more myth than fact. What matters is this: Carthage was erased from the map, and Rome emerged as the unrivaled master of the Western Mediterranean. But with great power came even greater problems. As Rome expanded, it absorbed vast territories from Greece and North Africa to parts of Spain and Asia Minor. This brought in enormous wealth. But it also brought in something more destabilizing: inequality. The spoils of war flowed not to the average Roman citizen, but to the aristocrats and generals who led the campaigns. These elite families accumulated vast estates, often worked by slaves captured in those same wars. Meanwhile, many Roman farmers who had formed the backbone of the early republic found themselves ruined, displaced, and forced to migrate into the cities, especially Rome itself. This created a volatile mix of poverty, resentment, and overcrowding. In response, reformers emerged. One of the first major ones was Tiberius Gracchus, a tribune who tried to redistribute land to the poor. His efforts were blocked by the Senate, and he was eventually beaten to death by a mob of senators. A few years later, his brother Gaius Gracchus took up the same cause again, only to be hunted down and killed. Their violent ends marked a turning point. Political disagreements in Rome weren't just about policy anymore. They were becoming deadly. As the 1st century BC approached, this pattern only intensified. Rome became a place of street fights, armed gangs, and constant factional struggle between two dominant political groups: the optimates, who favored the traditional power of the Senate, and the populares, who sought reforms for the common people and often bypassed the Senate using popular assemblies. Out of this chaos rose a name that would change everything: Gaius Marius. A general and populaire, Marius broke with tradition by allowing landless citizens to join the army, offering them pay, plunder, and eventually land in return. This professionalized the Roman military, but it also meant that Roman legions were now loyal not to the Republic, but to their general. Marius's reforms set the stage for a future where military power would define political power. He wasn't alone for long. His rival, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, marched on Rome with his own army, shocking and unprecedented move. Sulla took control of the city, executed his enemies, and declared himself dictator, not for 6 months, but indefinitely. Though he eventually stepped down, the precedent had been set. Armies now decided politics. And into this increasingly unstable world stepped Julius Caesar. Caesar came from a prestigious but relatively poor patrician family. He was ambitious, brilliant, and relentless. He aligned himself with powerful figures like Pompey the Great, celebrated general, and Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome. Together, they formed what historians call the First Triumvirate, an informal alliance that bypassed the Senate and concentrated power in their hands. Caesar eventually secured command of an army in Gaul, where he waged a brutal but highly successful campaign. Over the course of nearly a decade, he conquered vast territory and won immense popularity with his men and the Roman masses. But his growing power alarmed his rivals, especially Pompey, who had once been his ally but was now aligned with the Senate. The Senate ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. Caesar refused. Instead, in 49 BC, he crossed the Rubicon River, the boundary between his province and Italy proper. This act was both illegal and irreversible. It was, quite literally, a declaration of war against the Roman state. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon, he reportedly said, "Alia iacta est," the die is cast. He knew there was no turning back. Civil war followed. Caesar emerged victorious. He pursued Pompey to Egypt, where Pompey was murdered. In the process, Caesar became entangled in the dynastic politics of the Egyptian royal family and began a famous affair with Cleopatra VII. When he returned to Rome, Caesar was made dictator for life. He enacted a number of reforms, some practical, others symbolic. He restructured debts, expanded the Senate, and reformed the calendar into what we now know as the Julian calendar. But absolute power comes with absolute risk. On the Ides of March 44 BC, Julius Caesar was assassinated by a group of senators led by Brutus and Cassius. They claimed they were saving the Republic. But instead, they unleashed another civil war. Caesar's death created a power vacuum, his adopted heir. Octavian soon formed a second triumvirate with Mark Antony and Lepidus. Together, they hunted down Caesar's assassins and eliminated their enemies. But as always, the alliance couldn't hold. Eventually, Octavian and Antony turned on each other. Antony aligned with Cleopatra, and their combined forces were crushed at the Battle of Actium in 31. BC, Octavian emerged as the sole ruler of Rome. In 27 BC, took the title Augustus, marking the official end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the Roman Empire. It had taken centuries to build a republic. It had taken less than 100 years of instability, ambition, and civil war to end it. But the legacy of the republic endured in Roman law, in governance, and in the very idea that power should somehow be balanced. Even as emperors rose and fell, and the empire stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, echoes of the republic remained. And today, in countries around the world, people still look to the Roman Republic, not just for its grandeur, but for its cautionary tale. The fall of the Roman Republic didn't come from outside invaders. It came from within, from power unchecked, from institutions stretched past their limits, and from the belief that one man alone could fix everything. And that's a lesson that still speaks to us, even now.